Hello, my name's Olu Osha. I like talking about US presidents, and today I'm going to talk as briefly as possible about Teddy Roosevelt. He was our 26th president. Teddy Roosevelt came into office with the assassination of his principal, President William McKinley. I've talked about William McKinley before, and he was an effective president, but unfortunately, just 6 months into his second term, he was assassinated by an anarchist, and his vice president, Teddy Roosevelt, took office. It's interesting that they weren't really familiar with one another. That's William McKinley and Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt had been appointed very reluctantly as Assistant Secretary of the Navy by President William McKinley, and there'd been pressure on him, to appoint Teddy Roosevelt. And Teddy Roosevelt, one of the reasons why he didn't want to appoint Teddy, one of the reasons why President McKinley didn't want to appoint Teddy Roosevelt as Assistant Secretary of the Navy was because he thought he was very belligerent. He had this bellicosity, and he feared Teddy Roosevelt would fight everybody, to get into a fight with everyone. So Teddy Roosevelt was full of energy. He got a lot of stuff done. He'd been a writer. He'd been in law school. He dropped out to become a politician, and during his administration, he achieved a lot. He accomplished a lot. But he had these tempestuous bursts of energy that alternating with long periods of depression, and of course and all of a sudden he got extremely productive, and so historians have most certainly have diagnosed him posthumously as most certainly suffering from bipolar disorder. Of course, I guess they didn't have a term, they couldn't diagnose it back then, but uh, Teddy Roosevelt was a handful. He's one of the four presidents on Mount Rushmore, and so he accomplished a lot. Now, I read his autobiography. Um, he wrote it himself, and he was a good direct writer, and his autobiographies within the canon of American literature. I read his and uh, President Ulysses Grant's personal memoirs. They're both well written. They're both within the canon of American literature, American classics. Um, and I read both of them while I was wrongfully detained. That was something I decided to use my time for. I used my time to read every day. I woke up in the morning and I just read. I love reading, and I thought, I'm not going to let them imprison my mind. I'm being wrongfully detained. There's nothing I can do about it. One day I'll get justice, but in the meantime, I'm not going to let the state of Maryland waste my life or my time. So I decided to read. I read a lot, and I read Teddy Roosevelt. And in his writing, he wrote in a weird way. Today, people would definitely call him as having toxic masculinity, right? Because he had this. There was a time he gave, in his appendix, he gave an example of what he titled a manly letter, and he liked going out hiking, this nature stuff. There was a time when his wife died. He actually went out. He moved out west and became a cowboy. Now, Teddy Roosevelt was born into an elite family in New York. The Roosevelt family. Of course, his relative, his cousin, is President Franklin Roosevelt, who is our president who got 4 terms, right? Franklin Roosevelt was married to Teddy Roosevelt's sibling's daughter, his niece, Eleanor Roosevelt. And so Eleanor Roosevelt didn't have to change her last name when she married President Franklin D. Roosevelt. And it was Teddy Roosevelt who gave her away at the altar because Eleanor Roosevelt was an orphan by this time, and she lived with him, alternating. And yeah, so it's kind of interesting. So he came from this elite family. He went to Harvard undergraduate, and he graduated Phi Beta Kappa, and he wrote a lot. He published extensively. I think over his lifetime, he published over 40 books. And he also, he got into Columbia Law School. But while at Columbia, he dropped out of law school to go into politics, and so he was nominated. He was elected as in New York's legislature, and he was known for being very combative, very tempestuous on the floor, and he would debate very vociferously. And but interestingly, he was always on the side of the common man. He became like a populist. So he was a Republican, and he went up against the party machine. So he went off. Remember, I've talked about Roscoe Conkling and the party machine in the Republican Party, right? He went up against the party machine, and he was someone that's Teddy Roosevelt, and he did some things that are quite good. But he appeared, in as I was reading his autobiography, he appeared so sanctimonious, and I liked the fact that he went against the corrupt system. He tried to tackle it, and he distances himself from them. That he didn't really come up, he didn't get his appointments through the party machine, and he seemed like he was bucking the system and he was challenging it, but he just comes off a little bit sanctimonious, even though I like the fact that he was challenging big money. Back then they were called the robber barons, and of course they had the party machine in their pockets. There was a lot of corruption, so those were some of the things that he went up against. So there was a time during the Spanish-American War, he resigned his appointment as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and so he went and formed, a militia, a unit on his own. They are called the Rough Riders, and they went down to Cuba, and he writes in his autobiography, shows off somebody's testimony how he witnessed Teddy Roosevelt as an officer shooting at a man. Today we would find it horrifying, that somebody's bragging about how he killed another human being in battle, just close range. And I read Spare, the autobiography of Prince Harry, and Prince Harry had talked about the number of people he killed during his service, and there was this horror that came, this backlash, and everybody, everybody was mortified by, by the disclosure. Was it being, not even a matter of being boastful, because that's Prince Harry saying it. He was probably traumatized, or he was, was concerned, but he says it as a matter of fact. But at the same time, people think it's inhumane. It's jarring, and it just it's telling of the inhumanity of war, because this is a human being, and you're talking about how you killed another human being. Just you think it makes it look good, just because it happened in war. So a lot of the things that he writes about, that they will be considered, the manner he writes, it will be considered, toxic masculinity today. So he had a lot of toxic masculinity going on. That's Teddy Roosevelt. He did a lot of things. In fact, let me give another example of that toxic masculinity. There was an instance when he talks about when he went on a trail, like a hiking trail, in the West, and he had somebody as his guide, a Native American as his guide. He was out in the West, because Teddy Roosevelt, there was a time he went out west and he started a ranch with a bunch of real ranchers, cowboys, and he would go and he'd gather the cows, real rugged living. And this was somebody who was a city man, who was a New Yorker, he was born into privileged wealth. After graduating from going to school at 2 Ivy Leagues, and all that, but he was now living like a cowboy. At one time, he had this guide. He was going on a trail, on a camping trail or something. He had a Native American as his guide, and so he goes off. They got into a little bit of an argument, and the guy refuses to escort him any further or something. So he goes off on his own. Teddy Roosevelt's trying to coerce him to go, but he refuses. And Teddy Roosevelt just says that suddenly he feels threatened by the guy. And so while the guy's sitting down, in the woods, forest, or wherever they are, on the trail, he had his rifle next to him, and he's sort of dozing off or whatever. And Teddy Roosevelt comes, grabs his rifle and sticks him up. That's a stick up, and so that he doesn't come after him, because Teddy Roosevelt said he felt threatened, and so he rode off alone to make sure that the guy doesn't come after him and kill him, because Teddy Roosevelt just felt concerned that the guy might come and kill him later on. So he's paranoid. This was like crazy. And I was reading it, and he felt no compunction, nothing, putting this down in paper, and like what he did was actually crazy. And I guess that's part of why they diagnosed him posthumously with bipolar disorder, because he was just paranoid. He's gotten into this standoff with this guy. Not a standoff, the guy just, they'd gotten into a disagreement, and the guy, refuses to be his guide any further. And the guy's sleeping, and Teddy Roosevelt seizes he actually robs him. If another man did that to him, if a black man did that to a white man, he'd be hanged. At that time, they'd accuse him of robbery. So it was just crazy. And there was a time he was riding out, and he saw these Native Americans just riding towards him, and he gets paranoid, and he thinks they're coming for him, and he shoots at them, and they flee. He just shoots. So he does these crazy things. He shows this paranoia, and it's amazing that he thinks it tells you of the times. The racism, the xenophobia, the racism, the craziness of the times. And he's writing these things without thinking about, anybody's going to see him that, man, dude, you're crazy. In this modern times, maybe back then, maybe it was okay for white men to do these crazy things, to just be paranoid of Native Americans, because this was, I don't know. But as I was reading it, I didn't like him. I didn't like that. Yeah, I was like, things he did. He was passionate about America. He did a lot of great things about America, no doubt. He was known as a trust buster when he became president. He had the boldness to go after the robber barons. So robber barons is a pejorative they use for the railroads owners, the railroad executives, the early multi-millionaires and billionaires of the 19th century. They were called robber barons. The Andrew Carnegies and the J.P. Morgans, all those guys, they were called robber barons. So they had politicians in their pockets, and there was a lot of, again, corruption going on. There was a spoil system. So when Teddy Roosevelt became president, that was one of the things he was also going. He sort of was going after the spoil system. In fact, way before that, I remember Chester A. Arthur with the assassination of our 20th president, James Garfield. His vice president, who succeeded him, Chester A. Arthur, he reformed the spoil system, the executive patronage, through the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act, and subsequently under Benjamin Harrison, who was our 23rd president, he passed the Sherman Antitrust Act. Now, Teddy Roosevelt enforced these things very vigorously. There was a time when he was in New York. He was actually he was a commissioner of police. He was not exactly a cop, but his job was to reform New York City's police departments. And so he he was a very hard-working president, no doubt about it. Teddy Roosevelt was full of energy, and I guess that's one of the other reasons they uh, diagnosed him as being bipolar. He had this unusual capacity for work, and he loved America. He thought America should be a certain way, and he went fully. He rolled his sleeves up and went fully into executing his vision of what he felt America should have been. When he became American president, there was something he did. He reformed. He expanded the U.S. Navy, and he was an imperialist. He continued in William McKinley's mold, his thinking, and he invested heavily in the Navy. And he actually had a Navy fleet. It was called the Great White Fleet or something. He had the Navy fleet do a tour around the world to show off U.S. naval power. So it was like a show of force, and so he had this braggadocio manner about him. He supposedly had this African saying that he liked quoting. He said to talk with a soft voice, but walk with a big stick, right? And the bully pulpit. When you think of the bully pulpit, America using the bully pulpit, it is embodied in Teddy Roosevelt. So he was about American power. In foreign policy, he did most of it he focused on Central America, and of course he had the Panama Canal thing, and he bought off the French, and he invested heavily in the Panama Canal, and they say he's been accused of having sponsored the insurrectionists. The Panama was carved out of Colombia. It was part of Colombia, the country, and so he was accused of having. So I read some of his letters where he was defending himself that it's not true. They accused him of having sponsored insurrectionists and rebels in Panama to overthrow, to rebel against the Colombian government, and with the U.S. soldiers having supported them, and of course he debunks this, that look, it was an indigenous uprising against the Colombian government to be independent, for the Panamanians to be independent, have their own country. And so America paid Panama a lot of money, I think about $10 million or whatever. They paid them a lot. They paid them a lot of money anyway, to be able to have to construct and have the control of the Panama Canal. Again, the Panama Canal it cut the navigation routes of the U.S. Navy and merchant marines, and transportation navigation by connecting the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. By they created a canal through mountainous regions and landmass, and creating a shorter navigation route, and the U.S. had control of it at that time. And so other things that Teddy Roosevelt did domestically, he invested heavily in forests and conservation. Parks, national parks. He established a lot of national parks, forest reserves, and he advocated for the preservation of the U.S.'s natural resources for America's future generations. So that's something progressives would be happy that he accomplished, apart from his being repelled by his toxic masculinity. But yeah, so he did that, and he was known as a champion of the progressive era. So the 19th century America became industrialized, and industrialization brought its social problems with it. And so there was huge income inequality. The industries, the robber barons and all that stuff we created meant there were these unsafe labor conditions. There was abuse of labor. There were normally strikes and protests by laborers against, the management. And management would often break the strikes through using paid private police. So Teddy Roosevelt came in on the side of the common man, who were the laborers, and so he started to enact labor regulations for safer working conditions. And he started also to break the power of the monopolies. So he enforced the anti-monopoly, antitrust laws. He started to, really use the Justice Department to go after the big trusts and monopolies, and so he'd break them up. And he wasn't scared of them. He was a very tough guy. He went against, corruption, public corruption, very aggressively. And he completed William McKinley's second term. So he came into office after 6 months, after the first 6 months, completing the remaining 3.5 years of McKinley's second term. And then he now won office in his own right. So he did over 7 years as presidency. So he as a president, he would most definitely have won a third term, his own second term, but a third term. And he didn't want to do it. He was reluctant at the time. And so he had a protege, William Howard Taft. And William Howard Taft and Teddy Roosevelt were very close. And he was made governor of the Philippines. So anywhere Teddy sent him, William Howard Taft went to. So it was William Howard Taft had no plans to be president. All he ever wanted to be was a justice on the Supreme Court. And Teddy convinced him to run for president, and he did, and he won. However, Teddy was, he was missing his old job, and he now wanted the job back. But Howard Taft wasn't gonna, step aside for him. Howard Taft ran on the Republican ticket, but Teddy Roosevelt went on to form another party called the Bull Moose Party, and so he split the Republican vote. And in fact, so it became a 3-race, contest. And the Democrats, Woodrow Wilson, the university professor, and won the contest. Teddy Roosevelt came second, and Taft third. They became lifelong enemies, but Teddy Roosevelt didn't live long after his time out of office. He died at the age of 60. Prior to that, though, while he was contesting on the campaign trail, he was about to give a speech, and would-be assassin shot him. He actually hit him in the chest, but I think his glasses case saved him. And so while it did penetrate through flesh, because he was bleeding, that was when they realized he was shot. But Teddy Roosevelt didn't fall down. He didn't show any fear or anything like that. He continued with his speech, finished off his speech. And so he was a wild guy. He was a remarkable, very effective president. He wrote while he was in university, and for his thesis he wrote about the War of 1812, and he published many books. He published as many as over 40 books. He was noted as a writer. He accomplished many things. He was a cowboy. He was a sheriff, a deputy sheriff at one time. He liked this swashbuckling thing, and he was an unusual president. And I thought to just discuss Teddy Roosevelt today, because he did accomplish quite a bit during the progressive era. Let me end this here, and if I think up something else about Teddy Roosevelt, I could do a subsequent short video. My name is Olu Osha, and while I like talking about US presidents, I also try to create awareness about the injustice, perversion of justice I'm experiencing in Montgomery County, Maryland, where there's an abuse of process, obstruction of justice, and trumped up charges were filed against me, a law-abiding American citizen who was working in the federal government, U.S. Department of Defense and U.S. Department of the Navy, and trumped up charges were filed against me by the police who swatted me. I was a victim of a swatting. Swatting is a crime in Maryland and the federal government. Swatting is when a false crisis call is made to the police to generate armed law enforcement, large presence of law enforcement at the victim's residence. I was injured severely. I was shot in the head. These are stitches, where I was shot with a projectile to my head. I bled severely. I was left with several injuries. Right there, it's still there. That's a permanent scar that I was left with. I was brutalized in my own home without probable cause. I wasn't committing any crime. I was, interacting with my friends. The day before, I'd been at the gym. I've never threatened to shoot anybody in my life. I never owned guns. I've never been in a gang. But all of this was done. The swatting was probably done in order to obstruct an equal employment opportunity complaint I'd filed. It was to impede it, and other complaints I'd filed in the federal government regarding fraud. I reported people for fraud and other misconduct, and the swatting was done in order to forestall these investigations or to discredit me and possibly kill me. I was almost killed. The tasering, they were very severe. They injured me severely, so I had to be placed on IV fluids. But the Montgomery County Police Department has refused to hold the guilty, the erring police officers. It's refused to hold them accountable, and the FBI keeps referring the matter back to the Internal Affairs Division. My civil rights, there's been no inquiry into the civil rights violation. No one's been held accountable. To add insult to injury, the police officer who shot me in the head and the others who assaulted me filed trumped up charges against me saying I assaulted them. I've had no trial. There's been an abusive process for over 2 years. The judge in Montgomery County, Maryland, prevented me from working, saying he wanted me to lose my job, which is a violation of my liberty interest and fundamental rights. The state attorney filed trumped up charges without probable cause. They don't have any evidence that I committed any crimes. I was the injured party. The police officers had no arrest warrant. So the state attorney's office in Montgomery County, they filed these trumped up charges to smear me and make me appear opprobrious in my community, and to sort of blacklist me and make me appear like a criminal. I'm not a criminal. I'm a law-abiding person. I come from a respectable family, and I have conducted myself with dignity at all times in America. I'm an American citizen, but my rights are being violated. It's as if we're living in Jim Crow America. I know this is Maryland, so I'll keep you posted. Thank you.